Well, there are certainly plenty of references in the Bible to fearing God, but also there are many that say there is no need to be afraid of God. So which passages shall we choose? I don't feel free to make any such choices. I really believe we should take the Bible as a whole. If you take a piece here and a piece there, as we mentioned before, you can make the Bible teach almost anything. It's like the man who said, I found a verse in the Bible that there is no God, but he missed the words before. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. So we ought to take the Bible entirely. Of course, if God is as his enemies have made him out to be, particularly the arch enemy, we would do well to be terrified. But the evidence, I believe, is all to the contrary. Yet we do have that awesome message of the first angel in Revelation 14:7, who cries with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Does that mean that the message of this angel is, be terrified of God? So we need to go back through the Bible and see how the word fear is used. And if one has started at the beginning, one will have come, say, to the 128th Psalm, verses 1 and 2, where it says, happy is the man who fears the Lord. It wouldn't make sense to say, happy is the man who is scared stiff of God. He'd hardly be happy. So it must mean reverence, which the word fear can also mean. But let's look at a very famous verse in Proverbs 9, verse 10, and usually it's memorized from the King James Version. Would you read it there? And I'll look for it in the Good News Bible. Proverbs 9, verse 10.
This is the King James Version. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
So the beginning of wisdom is to be scared stiff of God. It
Seems
doesn't
so.
seem to make sense. I found in the classroom, if the student is afraid, not much learning takes place. It's when they become more comfortable, but not so comfortable that they're disrespectful. The nice combination that we call reverence and respect. And so the Good News Bible, as usual, is beautifully on target. To be wise, you must first have reverence for the Lord. I think that's precisely the point. But if a person thinks of God as a heavenly Nebuchadnezzar, we would do well to be afraid. If God says, love and obey me, or I'll throw you into the burning fiery furnace, what else could we be but afraid of our God and afraid to meet him? But going through the 66 over and over, there's such an accumulation of evidence to the contrary, not claims that God is love, but demonstration that he is a most gracious Father. Of course, when it comes to being afraid of God, so much depends on what we think God is going to do to us in the end, when we do come face to face with him. For that, I'd like to show you a wonderful picture from Loma Linda University in California, the famous picture of Christ and the physician at the bedside of a little girl. Now, as you look at that picture, the family looking on, the little girl ill, the attentive physician, and Christ in the background. How would you paint the next picture to follow this? Supposing the little girl said to her doctor, but I don't want you to make me well. I mean, go away and leave me here. Would the doctor say, for your ingratitude, little girl, I'm going to take you outside and kill you? Well, for one thing, he'd wind up in prison if he did such a thing. We simply would not tolerate it. Doctors do not kill their dying patients. All he could do is leave her to reap the consequences of refusing his care. But now, draw the next picture, paint the next picture as to what Christ would do if the little girl turned him down. Would he say, for your ingratitude, I'll take you out and not just kill you on the lawn, I'll slowly burn you to death on the lawn? It's inconceivable, isn't it? And yet it is so widely taught that God says to us, if you do not let me save you, then I'll slowly burn you to death. We naturally react against it. It simply can't be true. And so we go back to the Bible again and again, wondering where this came from and what the truth really is. Consider another picture, this one of the Good Samaritan parable that Jesus taught. You remember the man who went down to Jericho, and on the way robbers robbed him and wounded him, and the Good Samaritan came and looked after him. Supposing the sufferer had rejected the help of the Good Samaritan, would that generous man have killed him for his ingratitude? I mean, the man needed help. If he refused it, what could the Good Samaritan do if he was a good Samaritan? But sadly leave the man there in his condition, to leave him to the consequences. And I find all through Scripture that this is the picture we find of God. Well, let me ask you this, Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
What do you personally consider to be the most terrifying verse in Scripture, or if you wouldn't want to speak for yourself, representing all the people you know, what do most people consider to be the most terrifying verse in the whole Bible?
Oh, I've thought about that.
On the face of things.
And I think, generally speaking, it comes from perhaps what should be the best news at all, which is the three angels' messages in Revelation 14. Let me read it to you. It's Revelation 14 and verse 10.
Are you using King James again?
King James Version, the one that most people are familiar with. And let me read verse 10 and the first part of verse 11 of Revelation 14. The same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment ascendeth up for ever and ever. Now, I don't like that picture very much at all.
It is fearsome.
Yeah.
And yet these three angels come. The first one comes with the everlasting good news,
right.
and the second one says the opposition is collapsed in corruption and defeat, and the third one says, and if you don't accept the good news, this is what God will do to you.
That's right. Isn't that scary?
No wonder many don't particularly care to read that passage. Well, which word is the most important in there? The forever and ever, or the fire, or the wrath? Well, the wrath particularly speaks of God and his attitude toward us. I remember years ago, I spent a long time making up my mind what wrath meant, and I've done it with other people many times. Looked all through the Bible for references to God's wrath. The place that helped the most was Romans 1. Let me read it to you. In Romans 1, and each time we go through it, this is where things seem to become a little clearer. In Romans 1, Paul first talks about the revelation of the good news about God. Then he talks about the revelation of God's wrath. And he says that God will reveal his wrath to people who turn down the truth about him. He says there's no excuse that people don't recognize God. He can be known even from the things that he has made. And then in Romans 1:24, there's a description of what God will do to people who turn down the truth and thus turn down God. Therefore, Romans 1, now 24, therefore God beat them up, burned them up. No, God gave them up because they turned down the truth. He gave them up. And then look down to verse 26. For this reason God gave them up. And what follows is what he gave them up to. And then verse 28 for the third time. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up. 3 times the same word. And that's led us, as we've gone through, to describe wrath in some such words as these. It seems that in the Bible, God's wrath is simply his turning away in loving disappointment from those who do not want him anyway, thus leaving them to the inevitable and awful consequence of their own rebellious choice. And we know how God feels when he gives people up. Remember Hosea 11. He cries, how can I give you up? How can I let you go?
People sometimes say, and you often read in scholarly books, that God poured out his wrath on his Son at the crucifixion, and that was a clear demonstration of God's wrath.
Yes, if we're right in our understanding of the meaning of wrath, it would mean that when God poured out his wrath on his Son, he would give him up, just as in Romans 1, 24, 26, and 28. Is there a verse in the Bible that says that Christ was given up by the Father? And there is one in Romans 4:25, which is always very impressive to groups when they come to it. Let me look it up, and maybe you should look it up too in the Good News Bible. In Romans 4:25, it says, and I'm using the Revised Standard Version, Well, here it says he was put to death for our trespasses. And there's nothing in the Greek about being put to death. It just says he was given up. It is exactly the same Greek word in Romans 4:25 as in Romans 1:24, 26, 28. And to show that it was the wrath that was poured out on the Son and the meaning of that experience, it would be best if they all were translated the same, whatever word is used. Now, what do you have in the Good News Bible?
I've got he was handed over, but then they go on to say he was handed over to die.
To die. Now, there's nothing about to die. It's implicit because he did die when he was handed over. And if the Good News Bible perhaps had handed over in Romans 1:24, 26, 28, and in Romans 4:25, it would allow the reader to see the similarity and then be free to interpret it for himself.
Of course.
But then if Jesus was experiencing the wrath of God, that is, he was being given up, that is, he was made to be sin, though he knew no sin, he's dying the sinner's death, is there any record that he knew this was happening to him? Did he so interpret the experience? Well, we go to the cross and we hear his cry, my God, why have you given me up? Why hast thou forsaken me?" Those familiar words, those awful words. Now, does this mean that the Father was angry with his Son as he poured out his wrath and gave him up? No, we know from Hosea 11 that God would be crying over his Son, "How can I give you up? How can I let you go?" He did let his Son go, and he did die. And now we know that God has said to us, not love and obey me or I'll kill you, but love me and obey me or I'll let you go as I let my Son go, and he died.
I need to take you back now, Graham, to that idea of final judgment, which is so terrifying to many people. Is there any remedy in the Bible for this final judgment?
There's any good news about the judgment. Maybe look in the Good News Bible to read about the judgment in the Good News Bible. Well, there are many verses that speak about the judgment. One that used to influence me when I was a boy, Hebrews 4:13. Everything is naked and open before the eyes of him with whom we have to do, with whom we have the account. You can't hide anything from God. Or Ecclesiastes 12:14. Every secret thing will come into judgment.
That just makes it worse.
But it seems to, you can't hide from God. But then those wonderful words in 1 John 4:16 to 18, where it says, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out all fear. If we really know God and have become his friend and have found that God is love, this will make it possible to face the judgment unafraid. And the man who is afraid does not know God. So 1 John is very encouraging about the judgment, that if we know the kind of person God is and we're his friends, we can have confidence when we face the judgment. I have to show you here a remarkable picture by a friend, Jim Pearson, a friend he's a sculptor, and then a photograph was taken of this remarkable picture of the judgment. It's an awesome picture. It vividly reflects the feelings of many as they face the prospects of final judgment. You wonder who's holding the handle of that gavel as it comes down on the head of the poor man under investigation. How can we escape? Is there any reassuring news in the Bible on how we may escape or pass through or survive or look good in the judgment? Well, as we've so noticed in so many places, if we are God's friends, and if we know him as a friend, we have no need to be afraid. And one of the most striking places in the whole Bible is provided in the early books by Moses. For example, in Exodus 20:20, when God came down on Sinai and found it necessary to display some of his majesty and power to inspire a little reverence and respect from the people, so they would listen. And the ground began to shake beneath their feet, and there was fire and smoke and the sound of a trumpet. And the people were so terrified, Moses turned to them and said, "There is no need to be afraid," because he knew God, and he knew why God was raising his voice, because they were so hard of hearing.
Another way of solving this problem, apparently, is the idea that many people have mentioned to me, the fact that God has given to his Son all judgment. Do you
That's
see
true,
that as a good solution to it?
Well, John 5:22 does say that all judgment has been given to the Son. And I have friends who derive great comfort from that because they're sure that the Son is very friendly. They're not too sure about the Father. So if the Son is conducting the judgment, they're more likely to be treated sympathetically. It's more possible that they'll receive a generous deal. And yet, Jesus said in John 14:9 that this is not true. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. There's no reason for believing the Father would not judge us as kindly as the Son.
But doesn't the Bible say that we need somebody in between, presumably to protect us from the wrath of an angry God, to persuade him to be more forgiving towards us?
Well, since we don't have time to go through all 66,
That's a shame.
let me look at the most potent verse in the Bible on this subject. Look at John 16:26, and I'm going to read it in the Revised Standard Version. And usually when people read this, even in public places, they miss a certain word that we'll need to notice with care. This verse is introduced by Jesus saying, up to this time I've talked to you in figures of speech and symbols and parables about my Father. The time has come for me to talk plainly to you about the Father. Now look at verse 26. In that day, when I talk plainly, you will ask in my name, and I do not, notice the word not, say to you that I shall pray the Father for you. And yet many are anticipating that there is necessity for the Son to plead with the Father for us. No, he says, I won't do it. And he gives the reason why. For the Father himself loves you. If the Father loves us as much as the Son, why would there be necessity for the Son to plead with the Father? Now, how does that read in the Good News Bible?
It's got the not in there as well.
The not is there.
The not is
there. It really
there,
ought to
that's
be
right.
underlined in large black
do
letters.
not say
or
that I
gold
would ask,
letters. Goodspeed rendered this courageously. He said, I do not promise to intercede with the Father for you. He uses the word intercede. There's no need for me to intercede with the Father for you, for the Father loves you himself.
Why does the Bible picture the necessity of having somebody in between anyway then? Because you have the whole priestly system of the Old Testament as somebody between man and God.
And God gave the whole priestly system.
That's right.
Well, I think as a policy, it's always good to go back to the beginning and trace it through. You come back to Mount Sinai, and God is having to show his power in order to inspire the people to be reverent and allow him to speak to them. And in their terror, the people say to Moses, don't let God speak to us lest we die. You're his friend, you speak to God, and let God speak to you, and then you speak to us. In other words, they asked for Moses to be the one between, and God began to speak to the people through Moses and later through all the priests. So you see, this was a granting of the request of the people who were afraid of God to have a mediator in between.
So this will be one of your emergency measures.
That is an
again,
emergency measure, because when Moses went and talked to God, so he could talk to the people, who was between Moses and God? There was no one in between. And if you look in other places, Exodus 33 and elsewhere, God speaks of how he's able to talk to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. When two friends are in conversation, there's no need for a negotiator in between. You know, when union and management are at some distance from each other, there has to be a mediator in between. But between two close friends who love and trust each other, there's no need for the emergency measure of someone in between. When Abraham talked with God so candidly, there was no one in between. And we could use many other examples in the Bible.
But surely all through the New Testament, Jesus is described as our mediator, the one in between us and God. So surely you're going against all that the New Testament says.
Yes, and yet when we stop to think who Jesus was, you remember he asked the disciples, who do you say I am? And they finally acknowledged his divinity, that he himself was God. Who was between Jesus and the disciples in the upper room? Mm-hmm. They weren't behaving very well. Who was between Jesus and Judas when he washed his feet? And who is Jesus? if, as the Bible describes him as our Creator and our God, then there was no one between God and even his betrayer, Judas. So again, John 16:26, there is no need for anyone to plead with God in our behalf, for the Father loves us as much as the Son. So, as you put it, mediation is an emergency measure, because we really don't know God as we could. We are not yet really his friends.
I think many people are going to be surprised to hear you say this, because they think that Christ as mediator is so central to Christianity. You're saying we don't need a mediator.
No, I'm just saying we don't need a mediator to persuade God. We do need someone to reveal God to us. We don't need someone to work on God, for Christ himself is God. And then besides, remember in the book of Revelation, there is an accuser who accuses us day and night before God. We have an enemy. He's described in Zechariah and in Job 1 and 2 and other places. We need someone to stand between us and the enemy. We just don't need someone to stand between us and God.
Well, let's go back to that third angel's message again. And you'll remember that in our first discussion that we had, we saw all those terrible pictures of the burning fires of hell and so on. I asked if the Bible did talk about these flames that burn forever and ever. And if that is true, then I'm frightened of a God that does that to me. You said we ought to come back and look at that again, and perhaps this will be a good chance to look at it.
Yes, because if it's true, if God is going to burn us forever and ever, I would be terrified too. So let's look at the words forever. Right in the preceding book, the book of Jude, a very brief one, you notice in Jude 7 the use of the words forever and ever as related to fire. So how does it read? Jude 7.
In the Good News, it talks about the punishment of eternal fire.
That is, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed with eternal fire, and yet the fire went out a long, long time ago.
That's right.
Now, that would not be puzzling to the people who lived in those days, because they did not have a conception of eternity the way we think we do. Forever meant as long as it was supposed to last, perhaps as long as life should last. In Exodus 21:6, there's mention of the offering to a servant, or even a slave, of freedom, if he so chose. But if he would say, I would rather stay with my master, then he would be taken and a little hole would be punched through the lobe of his ear, and then he would serve his master forever. For eternity? Well, certainly no longer than his life would last, but it could be shorter than that. You look in good Jewish commentaries, and it will explain that he might have been released at the next Jubilee, which could be in the very near future. So forever means as long as it's supposed to last. That's all.
Well, what about the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is here in Matthew 25:46? It talks about the sheep going into eternal life and the goats going into everlasting destruction, the separation of the good and the bad at the end of time. So what is longer, eternal or everlasting?
Well, I've heard discourses on the fact that eternal maybe is longer than everlasting, or vice versa, but actually the Greek word is exactly the same. There is no difference between eternal and everlasting.
So if everlasting only means for a limited period of time, perhaps just as long as life should last itself, then perhaps everlasting life is not very long at all, and that's not very good news for us as Christians, is it?
Well, that's why when you read in the Bible that the righteous will live forever, that's in and of itself not long enough, nor is forever and ever long enough. The real clincher is Revelation 24, which says, there shall be no more death. That's true. Those who have become God's friends and have trusted him enough to let him heal the damage done, the ones that are described as the saved, they will live forever and ever, as long as life shall last. But the important words are, there shall be no more death.
So the fact there is no more death is really the important thing here.
That's right.
Not the question of everlasting life or eternal life and eternal fire and so on.
Right.
So now, are you saying that if you came face to face with God, even, dare I say it, right now, you wouldn't be afraid?
I've imagined what it would be like to come face to face with God. Surely it would be awesome. The Bible describes the angels as veiling their faces. And even when Moses said to the people at the foot of Sinai, there is no need to be afraid, he then spoke of the awe with which he reacted to the presence of God there on the mountain. I don't know how I'll feel. I'm sure my blood pressure will rise and my pulse will quicken, but I hope I'll remember the words that tell me there is no need to be afraid of God. I might have to reassure myself once or twice, but I know there is no need to be afraid of God.
I know that we've had many more questions in our minds than we've had time to ask. What will we do about that?
Well, why don't we spend the last time that we have together simply discussing the questions people are asking about God. That's all we'll do next time.